The email arrived with a cheerful, almost offensively bright subject line. Christmas in the Rockies. Final itinerary. I scanned a list of names. My mother, my father, my older sister Clara and her husband Tom, my younger brother Ben, his wife Sarah, and their 3 cherubic, if occasionally demonic, children. Everyone accounted for. Everyone, that is, except me. My name is Arthur Pendleton, 54 years old, and for the last 30 years, I've been a forensic auditor. My life revolves around meticulous detail, unearthing discrepancies, and tracing the often convoluted paths of financial malfeasance. I find a certain grim satisfaction in bringing order to chaos, in exposing truths hidden beneath layers of deception. This particular truth, however, was less about ledgers and more about a glaring omission in a family holiday plan, an exclusion so blatant it felt like a carefully redacted line item in the budget of familial affection. I didn't rage, didn't immediately pick up the phone to demand an explanation. My training, my very nature, leans towards observation first, analysis second, and action only when a clear, strategic path presents itself. I reread the email, then cross-referenced it with the flurry of texts in the family group chat from the previous week. Excited discussions about ski rentals, cabin amenities, who was bringing what board games. I've been uncharacteristically quiet in that chat, a passive observer, partly due to a demanding audit I was finalizing, partly due to a growing, nebulous sense of distance. Now, that distance had a name: exclusion. It wasn't an oversight. An oversight is forgetting to pack an extra pair of socks. Forgetting to include 1/5 of the immediate adult family members on a meticulously planned, expensive group vacation is a declaration. I closed the email, a cold knot forming in my stomach, a sensation not dissimilar to the one I get when I uncover a particularly brazen attempt to defraud a pension fund. It's a feeling of disappointment in human nature, mixed with a weary resolve to see the matter through to its logical, if unpleasant, conclusion. My mind, already sifting through the data points of recent family interactions, began to construct a preliminary hypothesis. This wasn't just about a Christmas trip. This was a symptom of a larger, systemic issue within the Pendleton family dynamic, an issue I had perhaps been too preoccupied or too complacent to address directly. The signs had been there, subtle at first, like faint pencil marks in a ledger, easily overlooked if one wasn't looking for them. Clara's increasing tendency to forget to include me in smaller family outings, always with a plausible excuse. "Oh, Arthur, I assumed you'd be too busy with work, or it was just a last-minute thing with the kids. You wouldn't have enjoyed it." Ben's habit of calling me only when he needed financial advice or a discreet loan, our conversations rarely straying into the personal. My parents, bless their hearts, were often the unwitting instruments of this exclusion, relaying information secondhand, their well-meaning attempts to keep me in the loop only highlighting how far out of it I had actually drifted. Their generation, perhaps, was less attuned to the subtle power plays, the passive aggressions that can define modern family politics. I thought back to last Thanksgiving. I'd driven 3 hours to be there, bringing my signature pecan pie, the one recipe my mother had passed down only to me. The dinner conversation had been dominated by Clara's upcoming promotion and Ben's new boat, his 3rd in 5 years. My own recent success in a high-profile fraud case, one that had made local news, had been met with a polite nod and a swift change of subject. It wasn't malice, not exactly. It was something more insidious, a quiet, pervasive sense of my irrelevance to their core narrative, unless I was serving a specific, practical purpose. I was the reliable, slightly dull, older brother, the financial guru, the emergency contact. Not, it seemed, a person whose company was actively sought for its own sake. The Christmas trip was merely the most egregious manifestation of this underlying dynamic. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of my apartment a stark contrast to the imagined boisterousness of their mountain retreat. What was the appropriate response? A demand for inclusion? A wounded protest? No, that would be playing their game, a game whose rules seemed designed to marginalize me. My professional life had taught me that the most effective way to deal with a system that is fundamentally flawed is not to tinker at the edges, but to introduce a variable that forces a reassessment of its core assumptions. And in this case, the variable would be my absence, my complete and utter silence. I wouldn't call. I wouldn't text. I wouldn't acknowledge the itinerary or the cheerful group chat updates that would inevitably follow. I would simply not be there. Not in their plans, not in their conversations, not in their curated holiday memories. Let them have their Christmas in the Rockies. I would have my own Christmas, a Christmas of quiet contemplation, of meticulous planning, not for a vacation, but for a fundamental restructuring of my relationship with the Pendleton family. The audit had begun. The days following the arrival of the Christmas in the Rockies email were a masterclass in feigned normalcy on my part. I continued my work, met my deadlines, even engaged in a brief, anodyne exchange with my mother about the weather. I offered no indication that I had noticed my glaring omission from the holiday roster. The family group chat, meanwhile, buzzed with last-minute preparations. Photos of ski boots, debates about the best brand of hot chocolate, Clara's detailed packing lists. It all scrolled past on my phone, a digital diorama of a life I was ostensibly part of, yet profoundly excluded from. I watched it all with the detached interest of an auditor examining a set of unusually creative expense reports. Each cheerful message, each shared emoji, was another data point, highlighting the casual, almost unthinking nature of their collective oversight, or perhaps their deliberate sidelining of me. Then, about a week after the itinerary email, and 2 days after I had quietly blocked all their numbers and muted the family group chat, my phone began to ring with calls from private numbers. I let them go to voicemail. The messages, when I listened to them later through my carrier's online portal, were a predictable mix of confusion and irritation. First, Clara. Arthur, are you getting my texts? Mom's trying to reach you about Grandma's casserole recipe for the trip. Call us back. It's weird you're not responding. Then Ben, his tone already laced with impatience. Artie, pick up. We need to confirm who's got the good toboggan. Seriously, dude, answer your phone. Finally, my mother, her voice tinged with a familiar anxiety. Arthur, dear, is everything all right? We're all a bit worried. We haven't heard from you. Please call when you get this. Worried. An interesting choice of words. Not, Arthur, we seem to have made a colossal error and forgotten to invite you on a major family vacation. But we're worried because you're not responding to our demands for information about casserole recipes and toboggans. The locus of the problem, in their minds, was clearly my silence, not their exclusion. This confirmed my initial hypothesis. My absence was not yet perceived as a consequence of their actions, but as an inconvenient disruption to their plans. The real fireworks began 3 days later. My sister Clara, having exhausted direct calls, resorted to email. The subject line, Arthur, this is getting ridiculous. The body of the email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive entitlement. She accused me of being childish and deliberately difficult. She lamented how my sulking was casting a shadow over their holiday preparations. And then, the piece de resistance. Frankly, Arthur, your behavior is incredibly manipulative, trying to make us all feel guilty by giving us the silent treatment just because you're not the center of attention for once. We all have busy lives, you know. Manipulative. The word hung in the digital air, a perfect projection of their own behavior. They exclude me from a significant family event, a decision that must have involved at least some level of discussion and consensus. And when I respond by withdrawing my presence and communication, a direct and, I felt, proportionate consequence. I'm the one being manipulative. It was a classic blame shift, a tactic often employed by those who wish to avoid accountability for their own actions. I didn't reply to the email. Instead, I saved it meticulously to a secure folder on my hard drive, labeled Pendleton Family Communications, File Exhibit A. My professional training kicked in. When faced with accusations, gather evidence, document everything, and maintain a calm, analytical demeanor. Emotional responses cloud judgment and rarely lead to a favorable outcome. My silence, it seemed, was indeed a powerful variable. It was forcing them to confront a void where my usually reliable presence had been. And instead of examining their own role in creating that void, they were attempting to fill it with accusations against me. This was not unexpected. In my work, I'd seen countless instances where individuals, when confronted with evidence of their own wrongdoing, would lash out, deflect, or attempt to discredit the auditor. It was a predictable pattern of human behavior when faced with uncomfortable truths. The flashbacks began to surface with greater clarity now, not as vague feelings of unease, but as specific instances, data points in a long-term trend. I remember my 50th birthday, 3 years prior. I'd specifically requested a quiet dinner with just the family, a simple celebration. Instead, Clara had organized a surprise party at a noisy restaurant, filled with her friends and Tom's colleagues, people I barely knew. When I'd expressed my mild discomfort later, she'd accused me of being ungrateful. "I went to so much trouble, Arthur. Can't you just appreciate the effort?" The effort had been about her desire to host a grand event, not about my clearly stated preference. Then there was the time Ben had borrowed a significant sum of money from me for a surefire investment opportunity that had, predictably, gone bust. When I gently inquired about repayment, months later, he'd become defensive, implying that I, with my stable job and lack of dependence, didn't really need the money anyway, and that family shouldn't be so transactional. My contributions, financial, emotional, practical, were often taken for granted, expected as a matter of course. My needs, my preferences, my boundaries were secondary if considered at all. The Christmas trip exclusion wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of years of subtle and not so subtle marginalization. My decision to block them wasn't an act of childish sulking, as Clara had so generously suggested. It was an act of self-preservation, a necessary recalibration of a deeply imbalanced system. It was the forensic auditor in me drawing a firm, red line under a column of unacceptable emotional debts. They called me manipulative. Perhaps they were right, in a way. I was, after all, attempting to manipulate the situation, not to gain an unfair advantage, but to force a long-overdue reckoning with the truth of our family dynamic. And the primary tool in this manipulation? My silence, my absence, the very things they had, ironically, sought to impose on me first. The audit was progressing. The discrepancies were becoming clearer with each passing day. The accusation of being manipulative, particularly from Clara, stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because it held a kernel of truth in the context of my deliberate withdrawal, but because it was such a blatant deflection, a refusal to acknowledge their own culpability. It was like a company caught embezzling funds, accusing the auditor of being too focused on negative details. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet, focused activity. The demanding audit I'd been working on was finally complete, freeing up considerable mental bandwidth. I redirected this energy not towards direct confrontation with my family. That would be unproductive at this stage, but toward a thorough internal audit of my own life and my relationship with them. I reactivated my gym membership, which had lapsed during the intense work period. The physical exertion was a welcome release, a way to channel the simmering frustration into something constructive. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd neglected due to the combined pressures of work and the often unseen emotional labor of navigating the Pendleton family dynamics. One such friend was Richard, a colleague from my early days in forensic accounting, now a successful consultant. We met for lunch, and I found myself, somewhat uncharacteristically, laying out the broad strokes of the family situation. Richard, a man known for his sharp wit and even sharper analytical skills, listened patiently. "Arthur," he said after I'd finished, "it sounds to me like you've been the designated responsible adult in that family for a very long time. The one who quietly fixes things, offers sensible advice that's usually ignored, and then gets blamed when things inevitably go sideways because your advice was ignored." He took a sip of his iced tea. "This Christmas trip thing? It's not about the trip, is it? It's about respect, or the profound lack thereof. Your blocking them isn't manipulative, it's a boundary. A perfectly reasonable, if long overdue, boundary. His words were a balm, a validation from an external, objective source. It reinforced my resolve. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about reclaiming my own space, my own peace of mind. Meanwhile, the Pendleton family's attempts to breach my wall of silence continued, albeit with a subtle shift in tactics. The angry accusation from Clara ceased, replaced by a series of saccharine messages from my mother, extolling the virtues of family togetherness, reminding me of cherished childhood memories, many of which, I recalled, also involved me quietly resolving some crisis caused by my siblings, and urging me to be the bigger person and reach out. These were the guilt-trip grenades, designed to exploit my ingrained sense of familial duty. I recognized the pattern. It was a common tactic in coercive control situations, albeit on a milder, domestic scale. I didn't respond to these either. Each unanswered call, each unread email, was a reinforcement of my new boundary. It was also, I suspected, causing increasing consternation within the family unit. I imagined the conversations. Why isn't Arthur cracking? He's never done this before. What if he really doesn't come to the cabin? The thought brought a faint, grim smile to my lips. I was, in my own quiet way, conducting a stress test on the family system. Their current operating model relied heavily on my predictable compliance, my willingness to absorb their casual disregard and still be available when needed. By removing that component, I was forcing the system to either adapt or fracture. The flashbacks continued, providing further context for my current resolve. I remember the year Clara's first business venture failed. She'd been devastated and on the verge of serious debt. I'd spent weeks untangling her finances, negotiating with her creditors, and quietly advancing her the funds to avoid bankruptcy. A loan she'd airily dismissed as a gift a few years later when her second, more successful, business took off. There had been no formal thanks, no acknowledgement of the personal financial risk I had undertaken for her. Then there was Ben, whose penchant for impulsive, ill-advised investments was legendary. I'd lost count of the number of times I'd talked him out of some scheme involving cryptocurrency, emu farming, or artisanal pickle production. My advice, usually delivered with a sigh and a detailed risk assessment, was often met with sulky resentment, as if I were deliberately trying to stifle his entrepreneurial genius. Yet, when his ventures inevitably crashed, I was the first person he called for a bailout or a sympathetic ear. My role as the family's unpaid financial advisor and emotional shock absorber had become so entrenched that they no longer saw it as a service, but as an obligation on my part. My exclusion from the Christmas trip wasn't just an oversight. It was a clear signal that my utility, in their eyes, had perhaps diminished, or that they simply felt entitled to my past contributions without needing to reciprocate with even basic courtesy or inclusion. Richard had been right. This was about respect. And respect, I was beginning to understand, was not something freely given by the Pendletons. It was something that had to be quietly, firmly, and if necessary, unilaterally reclaimed. The initial phase of my audit, the observation and data gathering, was largely complete. The next phase would involve waiting for the inevitable consequences of my absence to manifest more clearly within their system. Every system, when a key component is removed, must recalibrate. I was curious to see how the Pendleton family system would attempt to do so, and I was prepared to remain a silent, observant variable for as long as it took. The days leading up to the infamous Christmas trip were filled with a peculiar kind of silence from my end, a silence that I imagined was growing increasingly loud in the Pendleton family echo chamber. I continued with my life, work, gym, reconnecting with friends. I even started planning a small, solo trip for myself over the holidays, a quiet getaway to a coastal town, a place with windswept beaches and good seafood, a stark contrast to the enforced jollity of a crowded mountain cabin. The thought of a Christmas spent on my own terms, free from functional family dynamics, was surprisingly appealing. The attempts to contact me from the family had lessened in frequency, but increased in their underlying tone of anxiety. My mother left a voicemail that was less about guilt-tripping and more about genuine, albeit misplaced, concern for my well-being. "Arthur, dear, are you ill? We're all getting very worried. It's not like you to be so out of touch. Please, just let us know you're all right." I felt a pang of something akin to guilt, but I quickly suppressed it. My well-being was, in fact, improving daily, precisely because I was out of touch with their drama. Their worry was a consequence of their own actions, not mine. If they were genuinely concerned about me, rather than my compliance, the initial email should have been an apology and an immediate invitation, not a demand for a casserole recipe. Then, about a week before their scheduled departure for the Rockies, an interesting development occurred. An email landed in my inbox, not from a family member, but from Tom, Clara's husband. Tom was generally a decent fellow, if somewhat dominated by Clara's more forceful personality. He was a man of simple pleasures: golf, grilling, watching sports, and usually stayed out of the more complex Pendleton family politics. His email was brief and to the point. Subject: Arthur, a quick question. "Arthur," it read, "Clara's a bit stressed about the cabin financials. Apparently, the final payment is due, and there was some confusion about who was covering what portion. She mentioned you usually handle the spreadsheets for these big family trips. Any chance you have the breakdown from last year's beach house rental? Might help us figure this out. Hope you're doing okay. Tom." This was a significant data point. So, my role as unpaid family financial planner and logistical coordinator was now being missed. The confusion about payments was a classic Pendleton scenario. Everyone assuming someone else, usually me, had it covered. My usual meticulous spreadsheet, detailing per-person costs, shared expenses, and payment deadlines, was conspicuously absent this year because its creator had been conspicuously uninvited. I considered my response carefully. A part of me, the old, accommodating Arthur, wanted to just send him the old spreadsheet to smooth things over to alleviate Clara's stress. But the new boundary-aware Arthur, the forensic auditor of his own life, knew that would be a mistake. It would signal a return to the old dynamic, an undermining of my current stance. Instead, I replied with a polite, carefully worded email. "Tom, thank you for your email. Unfortunately, as I'm not attending the Christmas trip this year, I don't have any involvement in its financial arrangements or access to the relevant planning documents. I suggest Clara consult her own records or the primary booking agent for the cabin. I trust you'll all be able to resolve it. Wishing you a pleasant trip. Arthur." It was a masterpiece of detached helpfulness, offering no actual help whatsoever. It placed the responsibility squarely back where it belonged, on those who had organized the trip. I imagined the consternation this email would cause. Clara, expecting me to quietly provide the solution as I always had, would be furious. Tom would be caught in the middle. My parents would fret. Ben would probably complain that this was typical Arthur being difficult. The beauty of it was its unassailable logic. Why would I have the financial details for a trip I wasn't part of? My silence was no longer just a passive absence. It was now an active refusal to participate in their dysfunction, even from a distance. A few days later, another email. This one from my father. It was uncharacteristically direct for him. "Arthur, your mother is very upset. Clara is in tears about the cabin payment. There seems to be a shortfall of several $100s, and no one can agree on who owes what. This is not like you, son, to let things get so disorganized. Can you please, for your mother's sake, just help them sort it out? For my mother's sake." The familiar guilt lever. But this time, it had less purchase. I thought of George, my ex-father-in-law from my first marriage, and his words about load-bearing walls. I had been the financial load-bearing wall for so many of their ventures, their holidays, their mistakes. Now that the wall was refusing to bear the load, the decorative facade was beginning to crack. My response to my father was similar to the one I'd sent Tom, though couched in slightly more filial, yet still firm, language. I expressed regret that Mom was upset, but reiterated that I had no information regarding the trip's finances due to my non-attendance, and suggested they contact the rental agency or work it out amongst themselves. I did not offer to cover the shortfall. That, I knew, was the unspoken expectation. The forensic auditor in me noted the escalating attempts to draw me back into my old role. The initial confusion, the accusations of manipulation, the appeals to guilt, and now the direct request for intervention in a problem of their own making. Each attempt, when met with my calm, consistent boundary, seemed to only increase their frustration and, I hoped, their dawning awareness that the old rules no longer applied. The system was indeed being forced to recalibrate. And the preliminary results of that recalibration were, from my detached perspective, quite illuminating. The Christmas trip, which was supposed to be a joyous family escape, was already mired in financial squabbling and logistical chaos, even before the first suitcase was packed. All because one uninvited component of their system had quietly refused to perform his usual, unacknowledged function. The day of their scheduled departure for the Rockies arrived, and with it, a fresh wave of communication attempts, now tinged with a palpable desperation. My phone, still technically receiving calls and texts from their numbers, though I wasn't actively monitoring them beyond a cursory glance at the caller ID or sender before dismissing them, lit up with a frequency that suggested a gathering storm. I was at my local library that morning, researching historical coastal erosion patterns for a personal interest project, a far more soothing application of my analytical skills than dissecting family dysfunction. When I took a break for coffee, I allowed myself a quick scan of the miscommunications. There was a voicemail from Clara, her voice tight with unshed tears, a stark contrast to her earlier accusatory tone. "Arthur, please. The cabin company is saying there's an issue with the final credit card payment. Tom's card was declined for some reason, and mine is nearly maxed out from all the ski rentals and deposits. They're threatening to cancel the booking if the balance isn't cleared in the next 2 hours. This is a disaster. Please, Arthur, you always know how to fix these things." Then a text from Ben. "Dude, seriously, what the hell? We're supposed to leave in like 3 hours. The kids are all excited. Now Clara's freaking out about the cabin. If you did something to mess with the payment, that's seriously low. Did something to mess with the payment." The assumption, again, was that any problem must be my fault, my deliberate act of sabotage, rather than a consequence of their own poor planning or financial mismanagement. It was a fascinating insight into their collective psyche. Arthur, the reliable fixer, was also, in his absence, Arthur, the convenient scapegoat. I took a sip of my coffee, the library's quiet hum a soothing counterpoint to the imagined chaos in the Pendleton households. I did not call Clara. I did not text Ben. I did not offer to swoop in with my financial acumen and save their Christmas vacation. My professional ethics as a forensic auditor were clear. When investigating a system, one does not interfere with the process one is observing unless there is an imminent risk of irreparable harm to innocent parties. In this case, the only harm was to a potentially overpriced ski trip and the inflated expectations of my adult siblings. The children, I felt a brief pang for, but their parents were ultimately responsible for their holiday experiences. Later that afternoon, as I was enjoying a quiet lunch at a small bistro, another email arrived. This one was from my mother. It was long, rambling, and filled with a potent cocktail of guilt, anxiety, and passive-aggressive pleas. She recounted, in detail, the morning's drama, Clara's tears, Ben's anger, my father's stoic but obvious disappointment. She spoke of the children's crestfallen faces when it seemed the trip might be canceled. She reminded me of all the wonderful family Christmases we'd had in the past, conveniently omitting the many instances where I had been the one to smooth over logistical nightmares or financial shortfalls. She concluded with a line that was pure, unadulterated emotional blackmail. "Arthur, I don't know what we've done to make you so distant and unforgiving, but your father and I are not getting any younger. These family memories are precious. Please, don't let your pride, or whatever this is, ruin what little time we may have left to make them." I read the email twice, a familiar weariness settling over me. My mother, a woman I loved dearly, was a master of the implied obligation, the appeal to a sense of duty that had, for years, kept me tethered to a system that often felt profoundly unfair. But something had shifted in me. The forensic auditor, the man who deals in facts and verifiable evidence, was now applying that same rigor to his own emotional ledger. And the accounts were woefully imbalanced. Pride had nothing to do with it. This was about self-respect, about the belated recognition that my own needs and feelings were valid, even if they inconvenienced the established order of the Pendleton family. I drafted a reply, then deleted it. I drafted another, shorter, more pointed one, then deleted that too. Finally, I settled on a response that was both truthful and, I hoped, gentle enough for my mother, yet firm in its boundary. "Dear Mom," I wrote, "I am sorry to hear that the holiday plans are causing stress. It was never my intention to cause you or Dad any worry. My decision not to attend the trip and my subsequent need for some quiet space stem from a long period of feeling disconnected and unvalued within the larger family dynamic, exemplified by my exclusion from this particular family event. This is not about pride, but about a need to reassess my role and my relationships. I am not ill, and I am doing well. I hope that, despite the current difficulties, those who are going on the trip manage to find some enjoyment. With love, Arthur." I hit send, a sense of quiet finality settling over me. I had stated my truth, without accusation, without demanding an apology, simply laying out my perspective. The ball was now firmly in their court. Whether they chose to acknowledge my feelings, to reflect on their own actions, or to continue with their narrative of my being manipulative and difficult was up to them. My audit of this particular situation was nearing its conclusion. The discrepancies had been identified. The flawed internal controls had been noted. My report, in the form of my actions and my carefully worded email, had been submitted. What happened next was beyond my control, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace in that knowledge. I had done what I needed to do for myself. The rest was up to them. The coastal town I'd chosen for my solo Christmas was proving to be a perfect antidote to the manufactured drama of the Pendletons. The immediate aftermath of my email to my mother was silence, a profound, almost unnerving silence from the Pendleton camp. It was as if my calm, factual statement of my feelings had been a conversational full stop they didn't know how to punctuate. The previously frantic calls and texts ceased. The group chat, which I had unmuted out of a perverse sense of curiosity, the auditor in me wanting to observe the system's response, fell quiet. It was a telling reaction. When faced with direct, emotional honesty, rather than a problem I could be guilted into fixing, they seemed to have no script. I proceeded with my own Christmas plans. I booked a charming little bed and breakfast in the coastal town, a place with roaring fireplaces and long, deserted beaches perfect for introspective walks. I bought myself a few good books, a bottle of excellent single malt whiskey, and a new pair of hiking boots. The forensic auditor was officially on sabbatical, replaced by Arthur Pendleton, quiet enjoyer of his own company. A few days before Christmas, however, the silence was broken. An email from my father. Unlike my mother's emotionally charged missives, his was brief, almost terse, but it carried a different weight. Subject: Arthur. "Son," it began, "your mother shared your email with me. We have been discussing it. There are things, perhaps, that we, as a family, have not seen clearly, or have chosen not to see. Your exclusion from the Christmas trip was a serious misjudgment, and for my part, in not questioning it more forcefully, I apologize." An apology. A direct, unequivocal apology from my father. This was a significant data point, an unexpected deviation from the established pattern. He continued, "The trip to the Rockies did not, in the end, materialize. There were insurmountable logistical and financial complications once it became clear you would not be providing your usual, organizational input. Clara and Ben had a rather spectacular falling out over who was responsible for the booking errors and the financial shortfall. Your mother is, as you can imagine, quite distraught by the whole affair. So, the load-bearing wall had indeed been removed, and the structure, as predicted, had proven incapable of supporting its own weight. There was no triumph in this knowledge, only a grim confirmation of my assessment." He concluded, "I don't know what the future holds for our family gatherings, Arthur, but I want you to know that your feelings have been heard, at least by me. Perhaps, when the dust settles, we can talk. Properly. Your father." I read the email several times. It was a start, a crack in the facade of their collective denial. It wasn't a full exoneration, Not a complete mea culpa from the entire clan, but it was an acknowledgement. And from my stoic, emotionally reserved father, it was practically a Shakespearean soliloquy of remorse. I replied simply, "Thank you, Dad. I appreciate your words. Perhaps we can talk in the new year. I hope you and Mom have a peaceful Christmas, whatever your revised plans may be." Arthur. The day before Christmas Eve, I drove to the coast. The B&B was as charming as advertised. My room overlooked the wild, windswept Atlantic. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of salt and pine. I spent the next few days walking on the beach, reading by the fire, enjoying quiet, solitary meals of fresh seafood and good wine. There were no demands on my time, no emotional minefields to navigate, no expectations to manage other than my own desire for peace and quiet. It was, in a word, blissful. On Christmas morning, I woke to the sound of gulls and crashing waves, not the forced jollity of a crowded cabin or the simmering resentments of a family gathering gone awry. I took a long walk along the beach, the winter sun pale but warming on my face. I thought about the Pendletons, not with anger, but with a kind of detached pity. They were, I imagined, having a rather strained Christmas, their grand plans in tatters, their internal conflicts laid bare. Clara and Ben, no doubt, were blaming each other. My mother would be trying to smooth things over, her anxiety levels probably sky high. My father, I hoped, was finding some quiet corner to reflect. Later that day, I received a text message, not from my immediate family, but from my cousin Sarah, my father's niece. Sarah was a sensible, down-to-earth woman, a lawyer living on the West Coast, someone I'd always liked but rarely saw. Arthur, her text read, "Uncle George, my dad, told me a bit about what's been going on. Just wanted to say, for what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Sometimes families need a wake-up call. Hope you're having a peaceful Christmas, wherever you are." Another unexpected data point. An ally of sorts. Someone outside the immediate, dysfunctional vortex who saw the situation with clarity. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. It reinforced the sense that my actions, born of a desire for self-respect and a fair accounting of emotional debts, were not, as Clara had accused, manipulative or childish, but necessary and justified. My solo Christmas was a revelation. It was a reminder that my own company could be enjoyable, that my peace of mind did not have to be contingent on the approval or inclusion of others, even family. The forensic auditor in me had successfully audited his own life, identified the toxic assets, and written them down to their fair market value, which in some cases was zero. The restructuring was painful, but essential for long-term health and stability. As I sat by the fire that Christmas night, sipping my single malt, watching the flames dance, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The case of the excluded brother was, for now, closed. The findings were clear, and the auditor, for once, was at peace. The future of my relationship with the Pendleton family remained uncertain. But one thing was crystal clear. The terms of that relationship, if it were to continue, would be renegotiated with firm boundaries, mutual respect, and a clear accounting of debits and credits. No more unacknowledged emotional labor. No more being the silent, reliable fixer taken for granted. The load-bearing wall was now officially off-duty, unless a new, structurally sound contract could be agreed upon by all parties. The new year arrived, and with it, a tentative attempt at rapprochement from my father. He called, his voice still carrying that new note of consideration I'd first heard in his email. "Arthur, your mother and I were wondering if you'd be free for dinner next week. Just the three of us. Quiet. At our place." It was an olive branch, albeit a small one. I agreed. The dinner was subdued. My mother was visibly relieved to see me, fussing over me in a way she hadn't done in years. My father was more reserved, but his gaze was direct, and there was a new quality of listening in his demeanor. We didn't rehash the Christmas debacle in detail. Instead, my father spoke more generally about family, about communication, about the importance of valuing each member for who they are, not just for what they can do. It was a carefully worded monologue, clearly intended for my benefit, and perhaps, as a message he hoped I would understand, he was also trying to impart to Clara and Ben, though their receptiveness remained to be seen. Families are complex structures, Arthur, he said, looking at me over his wine glass. Sometimes the load isn't distributed evenly, and sometimes a vital support is taken for granted until it's no longer there. It can cause instability. An engineer's metaphor again. I appreciated it. I understand, Dad, I replied, and I appreciate you saying that. My mother chimed in, Clara and Ben, well, there's still a bit at odds. The canceled trip caused a lot of friction. Clara feels Ben should have managed his finances better, and Ben feels Clara was being too controlling with the arrangements. Predictable. The system, deprived of its usual scapegoat and fixer me, was now turning on itself. They'll have to work it out themselves, Mom, I said gently. It's not your responsibility to fix their disagreements. Or mine. She sighed. I know, dear. It's just hard to see them unhappy. This was the crux of it. My mother's desire for familial harmony often led her to enable dysfunctional behavior, to smooth over cracks rather than addressing the underlying structural flaws. My withdrawal had, perhaps, forced a small, uncomfortable confrontation with that reality for her as well. There was no mention of Clara's accusation of me being manipulative. I suspected my father had had a quiet word with her about that. Or perhaps, faced with the undeniable consequences of her own actions, she was beginning to see the situation with a little more clarity. Or perhaps not. Some audits take longer than others. Over the next few months, my relationship with my parents found a new, more balanced equilibrium. They made more of an effort to include me in their plans, to ask for my opinion, and actually listen to it, to treat me less like a utility and more like a valued family member. It wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. My relationship with Clara and Ben, however, remained distant. Clara sent a perfunctory birthday text. Ben called once, asking for advice on refinancing his mortgage, a request I politely but firmly declined, suggesting he consult a professional financial advisor. The message was clear. My pro bono family consulting services were no longer available. The real test came the following summer, when my mother tentatively broached the subject of the annual family beach house rental. Arthur, dear, we were thinking about the beach week. Would you be interested in joining us this year? This was it, a direct invitation, an opportunity for them to demonstrate that lessons have been learned. I considered it carefully. My solo Christmas had been remarkably peaceful. Did I want to risk re-engaging with the full Pendleton circus? Mom, I said, I appreciate the invitation, but before I can consider it, I need to know that things will be different, that there will be clear communication, mutual respect, and a fair distribution of responsibilities, both financial and logistical. I'm not prepared to be the default organizer or the emergency fund again. My mother was quiet for a moment. Understand, Arthur. Your father and I, we'll talk to Clara and Ben. We'll make sure things are equitable. Equitable. A good, solid auditor's word. The beach trip did happen, and to my surprise, it was tolerable, even at times pleasant. Clara and Ben, clearly having received a directive from my parents, were on their best behavior. Responsibilities were shared. Costs were divided transparently. Clara, an accountant herself when she chose to be, actually produced a spreadsheet. There were still moments of the old dynamic, the subtle attempts to draw me into resolving minor disputes or to solicit unsolicited advice. But I found it easier to deflect them, to maintain my boundaries, to participate on my own terms. One evening, sitting on the porch with my father, watching the sunset, he said, "You changed things, Arthur. Your quiet stand." It made us all look at ourselves, at how we operate as a family. Wasn't comfortable, but probably necessary. I nodded, appreciating his candor. The audit of the Pendleton family was, in a sense, ongoing, but my role had shifted. I was no longer the lead investigator, responsible for unearthing every discrepancy and enforcing every compliance measure. I was now more of an independent consultant, observing from a slight distance, offering input only when sought, and always with a clear understanding of my own value and my own non-negotiable terms of engagement. The most important lesson I had learned, the one I now applied to all aspects of my life, was the fundamental principle of forensic accounting. You cannot fix a flawed system by continuing to pour good money, or in this case, goodwill, after bad. Sometimes you have to stop the transactions, draw a line, and demand a full, transparent accounting before any new business can be conducted. And sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is the quiet, unshakable integrity of your own, well-audited bottom line. The years that followed the Christmas exclusion incident marked a significant recalibration in my relationship with the Pendleton family. It wasn't a dramatic, Hollywood-style reconciliation, full of tearful apologies and grand gestures. Instead, it was a slow, incremental adjustment, like a complex financial model being fine-tuned after a period of high volatility. The new equilibrium was characterized by more conscious effort on their part and more clearly defined boundaries on mine. My father, true to his word, became a quiet advocate for a more respectful and inclusive family dynamic. He didn't overtly criticize his other children, but he had a way of subtly redirecting conversations, of ensuring my contributions were acknowledged, of gently challenging the old assumptions that had led to my marginalization. My mother, though still prone to occasional bouts of anxiety-fueled peacemaking, began to understand that true harmony couldn't be forced, and that my need for space and respect was valid. She started calling me just to chat, to ask about my life, without an underlying agenda or a request for help. These were small shifts, but in the complex ecosystem of a family, small shifts can have significant long-term impacts. Clara and Ben remained a work in progress. Clara, I believe, harbored a lingering resentment that her attempt to paint me as manipulative had backfired so spectacularly. Our interactions were polite, cordial, but lacked the easy, if often superficial, warmth of the past. She was more careful around me, more aware that I was no longer a passive recipient of her moods or demands. She even, on one memorable occasion, thanked me for some old financial advice I'd given her years ago that had, belatedly, proven profitable. It was a small acknowledgement, but an acknowledgement nonetheless. Ben, on the other hand, seemed to have learned very little. He still viewed me primarily as a potential financial resource, though his requests became less frequent and more tentatively phrased after I consistently redirected him to professional advisors. His surefire investment schemes continued to meet with predictable failure, a recurring data point in his personal ledger of poor decisions. I maintained a polite distance, offering sympathy but no longer offering financial entanglement. My own life, meanwhile, flourished in the space I had created for myself. The solo coastal trip became an annual tradition, a cherished period of quiet reflection and rejuvenation. I delved deeper into my personal interests, took up landscape photography, and even started writing a monograph on the forensic analysis of historical financial documents, a niche but deeply satisfying pursuit. I found that by investing in my own well-being, by respecting my own boundaries, I had more to offer in my professional life and in the relationships that were genuinely reciprocal and supportive. The accusation of being manipulative for blocking them had long since lost its power. I understood now that it was a projection, a defense mechanism from a family system unwilling to confront its own dysfunctional patterns. My act of blocking them wasn't manipulation. It was a firewall, a necessary security measure to protect my own system from further unauthorized intrusions and emotional malware. True manipulation, as I knew from my professional life, involves deceit, coercion, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities for personal gain. My actions have been about self-preservation, about demanding a fair accounting, about insisting on the basic human need for respect and consideration. If that forced others to confront uncomfortable truths about their own behavior, then so be it. That was a consequence of their actions, not a product of my alleged manipulation. One Thanksgiving, several years after the infamous Christmas, the entire Pendleton clan was gathered at my parents' house. The atmosphere was different, calmer, more genuinely relaxed. Responsibilities were shared without prompting. Conversations were more inclusive. Even Clara and Ben seemed to be making an effort to engage with me on a more personal level, asking about my photography, my writing. During a quiet moment, As I was helping my father clear the table, he clapped me on the shoulder. "You know, Arthur," he said, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes, "this family, it's a bit like an old engine. Sometimes it needs a complete strip down and a rebuild to get it running smoothly again. And sometimes," he paused, his gaze thoughtful, "it just needs one stubborn bolt to refuse to turn until the mechanics finally pay attention to the damn specifications." I understood. I was that stubborn bolt. My refusal to continue enabling their dysfunction, my quiet insistence on my own worth, had forced a necessary, if uncomfortable, recalibration. It hadn't been easy. It had required a forensic level of self-analysis, a steely resolve, and a willingness to endure a period of uncomfortable silence and unjust accusation. But the outcome, a more balanced, respectful family dynamic, at least with my parents, and more importantly, a profound and unshakable sense of my own integrity and peace of mind, was a return on investment that no financial ledger could ever truly quantify. The audit of the Pendleton family and my role within it had yielded its final report, some accounts reconciled, some written off as unrecoverable, and one very significant asset, my own self-respect, fully restored and securely protected against future depreciation. The passage of time continued to smooth the rough edges of the Pendleton family dynamic, much like a river slowly erodes even the most resistant stone. The Christmas trip incident and my subsequent actions became a kind of unacknowledged watershed moment, a silent reference point from which new patterns of interaction began to emerge. There were no grand apologies from my siblings, no dramatic epiphanies publicly declared. Instead, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in their behavior towards me, a degree more consideration in their requests, a flicker less entitlement in their expectations. It was as if the system, having tested the limits of my tolerance and found them unyielding, had grudgingly adapted. My relationship with my parents deepened into a comfortable, mutually respectful adult connection. My father, in particular, seemed to view me with a new level of peer-like regard. We found common ground in our shared analytical natures, discussing everything from current events to the structural integrity of his latest woodworking project with a comfortable ease that had been absent in my younger years. My mother, bless her heart, finally seemed to accept that I was capable of managing my own life without her anxious interventions, and that my occasional need for solitude was not a rejection of her, but simply a part of who I was. Clara eventually achieved a significant level of success with her second business, a boutique marketing firm. With that success came a degree of self-assurance that, interestingly, made her less prone to the kind of passive-aggressive behavior she had exhibited in the past. Our conversations became more straightforward, less burdened by unspoken resentments. She even, on one occasion, asked for my professional opinion on a complex financial contract her firm was considering, a request she prefaced with, "I know you're the expert on fine print, Arthur, and I'd actually value your unvarnished take." It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about her evolved perception of me. Ben remained Ben, perennially optimistic, frequently overextended, forever chasing the next big thing. But even he seemed to have absorbed some lesson from the Christmas fallout. His calls for financial advice, which were usually thinly veiled requests for loans, became far less frequent, and when they did occur, they were couched in a new, almost sheepish humility. I continued to direct him to professionals, my own role as family ATM having been permanently decommissioned. The most significant outcome of that period, however, was not the change in my family, but the change in myself. The act of drawing a line, of weathering the accusations and the emotional fallout, had solidified a sense of self-reliance and inner strength I hadn't fully realized I possessed. The forensic auditor, so adept at dissecting the complexities of external systems, had finally applied those skills to his own internal landscape, and in doing so, had unearthed a deep well of resilience. I continued my annual solo trips, not as an escape from family drama, but as a cherished ritual of self-care and reflection. I expanded my photography, Even had a small exhibition at a local gallery, a quiet passion that brought me immense joy. My monograph on historical financial documents was eventually published by a niche academic press, a source of quiet pride. One summer, about 7 years after the Christmas exclusion, my father suffered a serious health scare. It was a stressful, anxious time for all of us. And in that crisis, the new family dynamic was truly tested. I found myself stepping back into a supportive role, but this time it was different. My siblings, particularly Clara, also stepped up, sharing the burdens of hospital visits, medical consultations, and emotional support for my mother. There was a new sense of shared responsibility, a collaborative effort that had been sorely lacking in the past. During one long night at the hospital, while my father was in surgery, Clara and I found ourselves alone in the waiting room. "Arthur," she said, her voice low. "I've never really said it, but I was wrong. About that Christmas, about a lot of things. You weren't being manipulative. You were just done, and I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it." It wasn't a dramatic apology, but it was heartfelt, and it was enough. "We all have our blind spots, Clara," I replied. "The important thing is that we learn to see beyond them." My father recovered, slowly but steadily. And in the aftermath of that crisis, the bonds within the Pendleton family, though reconfigured, felt stronger, more authentic, built on a more honest foundation. The old dysfunctional patterns hadn't vanished entirely. Families are, after all, ongoing, complex audits, but they no longer held the same power. I had learned that sometimes the most profound act of love for a family, and for oneself, is to refuse to participate in its unhealthy narratives, to demand a more accurate accounting, even if it means a period of uncomfortable, transformative silence. The exclusion had led to an accusation, which had led to a boundary, which had, in the end, led to a more honest and sustainable form of connection. The forensic auditor could finally close that particular case file, marking it not as manipulation, but as system recalibrated, integrity restored. And that, in any ledger, is a positive outcome. The final decade of my professional career as a forensic auditor was marked by a quiet sense of fulfillment, and my personal life, particularly my relationship with the Pendleton family, settled into a rhythm of respectful, if sometimes distant, engagement. The lessons learned from the Christmas exclusion and its aftermath had a lasting impact, not just on our family dynamics, but on my own approach to all relationships. I became more adept at recognizing and articulating my own boundaries, less willing to absorb the unacknowledged emotional labor that had once been my default role. My father's health scare, though a difficult period, served as a catalyst for a deeper, more authentic connection with him. We spent many hours discussing not just engineering or finances, but life, a shared history, and the quiet wisdom that comes with age and experience. He passed away peacefully a few years later, and at his funeral, it was Clara who leaned on me for support, a silent acknowledgement of the new, more balanced dynamic between us. My mother, though saddened by her loss, found a surprising resilience, buoyed by a family that was, in its own imperfect way, more cohesive than it had been in years. She often remarked that my father's greatest legacy was not just a successful business, but the quiet strength he had instilled in his children, a strength that had, perhaps, taken some of us longer to fully appreciate and embody. Ben, bless his heart, finally found a modicum of stability. He didn't strike it rich with any of his ventures, but he landed a steady job in sales, a role that suited his optimistic personality, and he seemed content. His calls to me became less about financial woes and more about sharing news of his children, who were growing into impressive young adults. He even, on one occasion, asked for advice on teaching his eldest son about responsible budgeting, a conversation I approached with a newfound sense of detached amusement and genuine goodwill. Clara's marketing firm continued to thrive. She became a respected figure in her industry, her earlier insecurities replaced by a hard-won confidence. Our relationship evolved into one of mutual, if somewhat formal, respect. The old resentments had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. We would never be close in the way some siblings are, but there was a truce, a recognition of shared history, and a tacit agreement to navigate future family occasions with a degree of grace. As for me, I eventually retired from forensic auditing, though I continued to consult on complex cases that piqued my interest. My monograph on historical financial documents gained a small but appreciative academic following, leading to occasional guest lectures and a quiet sense of intellectual satisfaction. My photography became a more serious pursuit, my eye for detail and pattern finding a new outlet in capturing the subtle beauty of a natural world. The annual solo trips to the coast remained a sacred ritual, a time for reflection, for recharging, for simply being. I often thought about that Christmas, years ago, the one I had spent alone by the sea, while my family's grand plans unraveled in the Rockies. It had been a turning point, a moment when the quiet, methodical auditor had finally turned his gaze inward, demanding a full accounting of his own needs, his own worth. The accusation of being manipulative for simply withdrawing, for refusing to participate in a dysfunctional system, now seemed almost quaint, a relic from a past era of unexamined assumptions and imbalanced emotional ledgers. I had learned that true strength often lies not in confrontation, but in the quiet, unwavering assertion of one's own integrity. It lies in the courage to step away from narratives that diminish you, to draw firm boundaries, and to allow others the dignity of facing the consequences of their own actions. The Pendleton family, in their own way, had eventually, if imperfectly, recalibrated. They had learned, perhaps, that every member of a system has value, and that the quietest components are often the ones most essential to its overall stability. My exclusion from that long-ago Christmas trip had been a painful, if clarifying, event. But in the grand audit of life, it had also been a necessary one, a catalyst for a profound and ultimately positive restructuring. The final balance sheet showed a life lived with quiet integrity, a peace hard-won but deeply cherished, and a family, however flawed, that had found its way to a more honest, if less idealized, form of connection. And that, the forensic auditor in me concluded, was an outcome worth every meticulous, boundary-setting step it had taken to achieve.